Good evening. Welcome to this Zoom meeting of Bowburn Local History Society, and welcome especially to Nick Miller, the Edith Cavell Archivist from Norfolk, who's going to tell us about Nurse Cavell and help us think about why it was that Bowburn's famous banner in 1920 carried her portrait.
Good evening to all watching. It's a great pleasure to be with you from Norfolk. I'll explain where I'm sitting and how it relates to Edith Cavell as we go along. Basically, this meeting started 9 years ago, would you believe it? Mike wrote to me way back saying, can I ask you about this Bowburn banner? And at that point, you got somebody else to talk about Edith Cavell. And now here we are 9 years later, and you've got me. And I hope this will be of interest to those watching this video and understanding the story more fully. I am, as you can see, her archivist, Edith Cavell's archivist down in Norfolk. I've been doing this for about 10 years and have a huge amount of stuff about her in my home. I'm in close liaison with the cathedral here and the Norfolk Record Office, and it's lovely to share some of this with you. So, why did a Bowburn banner remember her in 1920? Well, what a good question. Let's have a look at the banner. There is Edith, probably aged about 30, just before she started nursing. And here she is on the banner. And later on in the talk, you will see exactly where that banner image came from and how it's been teleshopped or whatever, photoshopped so that she has a letter in her hand rather than a dog at her feet. So we're going to try and find out why that comes to be. And the answer is probably I don't know. You'll hear more about it later on. But you'll see the context within which your banner came into being. So I'm going to start with three possible links between remote Norfolk in its rural glory and the world of miners and Bowburn and the banner. First of all, I imagine people might know the left-hand symbol. If you're an ardent follower of football, Norwich City Football Club has been in the Premier Division and is now in the Championship. And that is its coat of arms. It's a canary with the castle of Norwich and its emblem. And the link there is that just as Bowburn miners had a group that Mike tells me started way back in the 1900s with singing birds and the rest as the focus. So we had the same down here. And in 1922, when the football club, which is much older than this, decided that a canary would be a very suitable symbol for them. So there's a link between Durham and Norwich. Secondly, there's a picture of a Belgian coal miner down one of the old coal mines in the very south of Belgium. These coal mines and the mining community are, for me, kind of linked to Bowburn and your communities. They showed an enormous amount of courage in the First World War in Belgium in sheltering Allied soldiers, French and British. And we will hear more about that as we go along. So the courage of a miner working underground and the hardship that they endured and their commitment to helping others in need around them is parallel between you and them. And thirdly, we find a rather, blurry image of a little round thing which is about 45 millimeters across. It's round and it's got a sort of an indentation in it in which it contains liquid. And this has turned up in the last few years in my researches. and it is actually a trench lighter from the First World War. And I have discovered some made in France, carried by French soldiers in the trenches, and some made in America, carried by US soldiers, and some which honour Belgium by having the Belgian coat of arms and flags on the left-hand side. But all of them have on the right-hand side, in this particular instance, they have an image of Nurse Edith Cavell. Basically, these men are sitting in the trenches with a terrible stench. They have to smoke to manage to get rid of the stench in their nostrils. And the little wheel at the top of the left-hand image is a wheel that produces a spark from a flint, and the little nozzle on the left is actually where the lighter fuel comes out in a little wick. And they could use these lighters in the trenches safely when a standard safety match that you and I use today would never work because it was too damp. Just the conditions were against it. And so we see Edith actually in the palms of men fighting the war against the Germans as a symbol of hope, a symbol of resistance, a symbol of courage and of heroism. And I think all those three things that we've just looked at, the canary, the mining community, and the courage there, and then these lighters, all speak to me of hope, that there is, amidst the carnage of war, and it was horrible, amidst the mud and the stalemate, there was still people holding things or looking to things or remembering things which gave them hope. And that's what I want to just focus as a silver thread right through this evening's understanding of the historical events and all the rest of it. She, in particular, is a lady of hope in a very, very dark time. And she's representative of many today who are similar representations of hope in Ukraine and in many war-torn places, Gaza, etc. So that's my golden thread for the evening. On we go. Where do we start? We start in Swardeston. That house is about 400 yards from where I sit. It's got many, many more trees around it now. That's where she was born, in the room above the white door, in 4th of December, 1865. So next year in December, she was born 160 years ago. That was where her father was hiring the house, renting the house from a farmer, while he built this house, which was his vicarage. He was the vicar for the village, and that is immediately next to the church. If you look to the left-hand side of the house, there's a grey mass set back, and that is the church tower. The church is 14th century with a 1450 tower and a 1550 Tudor porch. And he was vicar for 46 years in this village. That is about 800 yards from this house where I'm speaking. I'm in the old school of the village. So lots of history. She knew this very room. She would have sat in here as an adult with the first head teacher of the school and talked about the children that she knew. And it was just embedded in village life. If anybody ever comes, for goodness sake, through Mike, get in touch with me, tell me you're coming, and I'll do you a little tour. And I love doing it because it's a great, great place to show off. This is the church. There's the tower, and that's how it. The bottom picture is how it was roughly in 1900. There is a coal heater in the middle there with a big chimney going up into the medieval roof. There were some pews, and the vicar preached an hour-long sermon from the pulpit on the right. The screen is medieval and beautiful, and notice the window at the end. That was just plain glass. Okay, it's got some nice stonework, but plain glass. We'll hear more. Here's the family. I'm not going to do a lot of this, but this is just a bit of background. The family. You can see on the left, Edith standing there, aged around 16, 17. Frederick, the father, 57, big beard, serious character. Jack, the youngest brother, well, the only brother, but the youngest child, about 9. Lillian to his right, his left, your right, aged 11. Florence, aged 14, and the mum, Mrs. Sophia Cavell, aged 46. And that's Edith's family. She corresponded regularly with her mum, as you'll see in the war. There's very little correspondence with the rest of them. Both the sisters actually nursed even before she started nursing. Jack stayed here in Norwich and was with Norwich Union. I don't know if people know the old Norwich Union, but he was quite a significant figure there. Now, I'm going to cut an awful lot of history out because she goes from being a schoolgirl there through being a governess, which she did for nearly 10 years, ending with 5 years actually in Brussels. She'd already learnt French well. Brussels family said, come over, take over our children, teach them English. And she did that for 5 years, very, very happily on all sides, apparently. And she really, really loved the place. But she needed to come home in 1895 when her father, who you've just seen, got really quite sick and nursed him with no training at all. But that triggered her into saying, I want to be a nurse. And that's one of the big choices in her life. I want to try and highlight where she made crunchy choices which would affect the future and where she had courage to do that. She's a reasonably well bred English lady. Nursing at that stage wasn't actually very open to, well, very often taken on as a career by this sort of woman. And she said, it's just, going to hit 30 very shortly. If I don't get into nursing now, they won't let me in. So she did. And nursing in the East End of London, toughest possible area, really. Sister had been at St Thomas's in London, frightfully well off area, but this is really tough stuff. Jack the Ripper was at work while she was trained in nursing. This is the historical context. So she made that choice. But most importantly, we've got to a second choice here. That's another 10 years on. She'd had her training, she'd been in different posts in London and also in Manchester. That's, I think, the furthest north I've ever managed to get her, to work for 6 months in Manchester. But this guy, who was a very eminent Belgian surgeon, invited her in 1907 to come and start British style, Florence Nightingale style nursing in Brussels for him. He had hitherto had to depend on nuns who came in rotation. So they came for 6 months, he never knew how long. He trained them, got them useful, and then suddenly they had to go off to do something else for the sisters that they worked with. And he got a whole load of new people. And he said, that's not good enough. I've got to have people who are around, who get really experienced, well trained, and then we build a career and a community for nurses. So that's what he was aiming for. And in 1907, he, a man of vision, said to this Edith, you've got vision, come and do this for me, with me, here in Brussels. See how it goes. Well, that's quite a big choice, leaving England again, but also going to a completely new setup with medics all speaking French around her, not necessarily accepted initially by the Belgian doctors in the hospital that Depage ran. Basically, she said, why do we have to have somebody from England? But there didn't actually happen to be anybody from Belgium who had the necessary experience. So they got used to her. I must tell you one lovely little story just to amuse you. You can see he's a serious player, and he really was top of his tree. And the very first morning, with her new nurses that had just arrived to train, literally just Edith, plus a sister from England with experience, and these bunch of about 5 or 6 nurses, they trooped into Depage's study in the hospital. And he waltzed in and he sat down at his table, looked at them all rather quizzically, and said, right, let's get on with it. And she actually put her hand up and said to him, Dr. Depage, it would be very courteous if you would say good morning to my nurses, which I thought was just lovely. I mean, start that with a man that you're going to work for and challenge him on his own ground, that shows guts. And I think the guts is all part of the story. So these are the houses that he bought for her, he and a committee of well-wishers, and they accommodated the trainee nurses, they accommodated some clinics, they accommodated a few patients' beds, they accommodated staff to keep the place clean and to do the feeding and the rest. And she managed. I mean, basically, each house was a separate entity, and it's very, very awkward. Every time you wanted to get from one to the next, you had to go out onto the pavement. Anyway, that was what she inherited, and she said, "Okay, I'll make the best of that." And she had her own room in the house, training rooms for the nurses, and so on. You can see they've actually got space in the roof. You'll hear about the roof later on. So here she is, and here's a picture a bit like yours of her with a few trainee nurses in about 1910, and her favourite and much loved dog Jack at her feet. And here's another one with Jack on the left and Don, her other dog. Now, interestingly, both these dogs were strays, and she picked them up off the street and said, "Come and live with me." And Jack stayed with her to the end and eventually died in Belgium in 1923 and ended up stuffed in the War Museum in London and was the children's favourites of the years gone by. Now he sits in lonely isolation at Duxford in Cambridgeshire in a massive aircraft hangar, along with a whole load of other stuff from the IWM. We want to get that dog back to Norfolk, and I'm trying to persuade the wonderful museum here in the castle, the Norman Castle, to ask for him on permanent loan back because he's so important to our history. There she is. If we go back, okay, remember that picture, and we'll just go back to that one. See where it comes from? That was a very, very common postcard of her, often raising money for Belgian relief funds and later for her own homes that were opened in her name after her death, because it was one of the best pictures of her in her garden at the back of those houses in Brussels. Now, choices. This is a crucial slide about choices. She was on holiday in Norfolk from early July 1914. Every year she had a holiday. She had to come and see her mum, who was living in Norwich, by this time a widow, and she needed a break, and she would come. Usual stuff. When early July came over, and then late in July, she got a telegram from a colleague in Brussels: "If you don't hurry back, you won't get back here. The place is about to be invaded. That's the situation. You've got to make a choice." And that telegram arrived in Norfolk on Saturday, August the 1st. She made a decision, because she was in Norwich on that date, to get back to Norfolk, where all her clothes and her suitcases were and all the rest of it. Late August the 1st afternoon, she actually made the decision that she had to get back to her nurses and to be there for the war, basically. Now, she could have said, "Oh, you know, it's too dangerous. I will wait until the war is over. It'll be over in 6 months." They all said that, and I can do useful things here. But no. She said, "My duty is with my nurses, no question. Mum, too bad if she's just going to have to fend for herself while the war's going on." And away we went. So she packed, she got on a train to London the next morning on the Sunday, August the 2nd. Amazing train services in those days. From London, Liverpool Street, across to Victoria, down to Dover on August the 2nd, on the night ferry to Ostend, August the 2nd, arriving Ostend, August the 3rd, first thing in the morning, train Ostend to Brussels, August the 3rd, still the morning, back at the Clinique, which you just saw. And August the 4th, look how tight that is. August the 4th, 11:59, we were at war with them. Germany had already invaded Belgium by that stage of the day. So quite tight, but she'd made a choice, and this is the story, really. We only know about her today, we're only interested in her today because of that crucial choice. She chose to nurse, she chose to go to Brussels to work, she chose to go back as war broke out. That's a choice she had to make. Collateral damage. Mum left back in Norwich, a widow, age 75. So basically, I think often I talk and say to a title of a forgotten heroine. And I wonder what a heroine really means to you. You may know in your own life who people you'd regard as heroines or heroes. But heroism really involves selfless action, hope despite the odds, taking no regard of risk, and putting others in need first. Maybe we can discuss that at the end if you've got other characteristics that are that of a hero. But those four, to me, tell her story. Selfless, hoping, risk averse, no, not risk averse, risk, ignoring risk and saying others' needs are more important than my own. So where's it come from? I'd suggest a sense of duty. We've already heard that. My duties with my nurses. My duty was originally to sign up as a nurse. A self-discipline, saying, actually, I've got to take some nasty decisions and I will be disciplined about these things. But again, the hope for better things to come when in a dark place. But fundamentally, we saw the pictures of the church and her vicar father. I think that the real core of it is that she knew that she was loved by Jesus Christ. And this verse is probably the key to the whole understanding of Edith Cavell. Here, this is how she would have read it in her own Bible. John's letter, first letter, chapter 3, verse 16. Hereby, this is exactly the word she would have known, because there was only an authorized version then. Hereby perceive we the love of God, because he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. That, I think, for me, is the call to the woman. And the rationale and the ethical reasons why she did what she did, the heroism. We ought to lay down our lives because we have had a life of Jesus Christ laid down for us in the love of God. This is what she was coming to, the wounding and wounded of the First War. Triage, take them out to the front line, bring them back a bit, sort them out, then get them back to full hospital care. Learned an awful lot about how to deal with wounded people in those first few months of the war. What she was in the process already of doing by 1913, she'd already laid the foundations for this enormous new building of a new nursing school, which would be appropriate for the sorts of numbers. She was getting 40, 50, 60 new nurses coming to her every year, and she needed more space. So this is what she was in the process of building. Another symbol of hope, because that was completely stalled. It's like COVID hit us. No building went on. This was stalled by World War One starting in August, and it took a long time to get going again. But just as she was about to be arrested, she was able to write, and you'll hear the letter in a minute. Basically, we're just in the process of moving what nurses we've still got and the patients that we've got into that building. Amazing. I don't know, vision. I just think, I'm not going to live with this tatty old four houses that are really awkward. Let's build something decent and for the future. Excellent stuff. So by August the 20th, now this is really something. By August the 20th, in Brussels, they had already organized 18,000 beds to receive the wounded. That's August the 4th to August the 20th. So that's just over 2 weeks. They found 18,000 beds. The Queen gave up the royal palace, a bit like giving over Buck House to the task. And Edith was right in the middle of all that with the Red Cross doing all the work. The powers that be said the king needs to get out. Depage got out to nurse people behind the lines out of Belgium, well, out of central Belgium. And basically, we will not fight these Germans. This is because life in those first few weeks of the war was really, really rough. The Germans had 1 million troops. They had enormous amounts of armament. And I'll just read you a tiny bit. Belgium's gateway city on the River Meuse, Liège, had a citadel, had merchant houses, alleyways. The battle to defend it lasted 12 days. Outside the city were 12 huge concrete forts, 6 on each side of the river. Neither these nor the Belgian force of 70,000 men could possibly withstand the German army's onslaught with their Zeppelin bombs and Big Bertha guns. Big Berthas took 1,000 men to assemble and had a range of 15 kilometers, firing shells weighing 820 kilos. Edith Cavell wrote on August the 15th, "We have just heard that there's been a huge battle, over 700 wounded. Some of these have arrived here, some will come in the night or tomorrow. Crowds assemble to see the wounded carried to the waiting ambulances, the men with bald heads, the women with wet eyes. War is terrible in this little country where everyone has a relative or friend in the army, and where the fighting furthest from us must still be very near at hand. The young men who went so short time ago and in such brave spirits are now brought back. One can hardly think how, even though one has passed over 20 years among the sick and suffering." So this is the reality, and they just said, Brussels said, there's no point in trying to resist this lot. And so the Germans walked in. Here they came. And what she said about them as they come into her city is, "We were divided between pity for these poor fellows, far from their country and their people, suffering weariness and fatigue from an arduous campaign, and hatred of a vindictive foe, bringing ruin and desolation to hundreds of happy homes and to a prosperous and peaceful land." That's her all over. She knew they were being a huge injustice being done, huge wrong, but she had pity. She saw the men, she saw through the uniforms, she saw the lost young men, people completely out of their thing, wondering, where are we going? They had some idea they were going to Paris. And is this Paris, they said? No, it isn't Paris. You've got a long way to go. And of course, they managed to keep them from getting to Paris. And obviously, the trench warfare ensued. She was dealing both with wounded British and French soldiers and Germans, all in the hospitals in Brussels. And she said then of that, "Any wounded soldier must be treated, friend or foe. Each man is a father, husband, or son. As nurses, you must take no part in the quarrel. Our work is for humanity. The profession of nursing knows no frontiers." Now, that's nursing ethics for you from way back, but it really meant something to her, and she was making sure that her folks, her nurses she was training, the nurses she had already on her staff, would not be partial. Eventually, the Germans took their own soldiers and said, "We can't have the risk of them being poisoned by Belgians," lots of anathematization going on. Actually, the nurses and the doctors were there in the cause of humanity. So meanwhile, she knew that many of the British and French soldiers and some of the Belgian army were stuck behind the German lines as they advanced towards Paris. They'd just been rolled over effectively, and that people were at very high risk of being found and shot by German occupiers. The Germans put up posters everywhere in French saying, "Hand these men in or be shot." So she knew that if she ever had to help these men when they went in hiding, trying to get away from the Germans, and basically, what were they doing? They were going on to Holland, which was not engaged in the war, neutral country, and that would allow them both to get back to France by sea or back to England and then back into the forces. She knew it. And number 5 choice. This is a really crunchy choice. The rest is where we know her from. That day through for 9 whole months, she kept on allowing these soldiers in, knowing that if they were found, particularly as they were not in military uniform anymore, they would be shot as spies, and knowing that the Germans had warned that this is total war. If you're helping people who've been fighting against us and will fight against us again, then we will shoot you. That's a choice, isn't it? So there's a little map which gives you some idea. The Germans came in from Germany across through Liège, as you just heard, right away across onto Mons, which is where most of her men came from, Mons and Charleroi, and went on down into France and on through to Paris. They couldn't go down south directly from Germany into France because the French had fortified the whole place so effectively. They knew, the Germans knew that would bring the British into the war because we had signed a treaty in 1830. This is where history comes back and bites you. We signed a treaty on the foundation of the post-Napoleonic new nation of Belgium that should anybody ever threaten your liberty, we're there for you. We'll be on your side. Early version of NATO, really. And that's why we entered the war on August the 4th, 1914. And we had a British expeditionary force in there. The Belgians had some people, and the French came in from the south, and that's the battleground. Here is the opposite of the battleground. This is the secure place, the safe place. I've been to this lovely chateau just on the Belgian south border, and the men from the surrounding area who were brought in by locals saying, these are soldiers, we don't know how to talk to them, they're at risk from the Germans. The men were hidden in the tower with a spar on it. The walls of that are 12 feet thick. You cannot hear anything that's going on in there in the main building. I can tell you because I've been there. And you can go there as well if you really want to. Chateau de Belligny, it's recently been reopened as a quite smart bed and breakfast place. It's full of history. The Germans occupied the main building where the windows are and the car is. This is the chateau of the Princess and Prince de Croÿ, and basically they had their big meals at all along is the ground floor is a huge dining room, and they sat and enjoyed the wines of the cellar of the Prince de Croÿ and talked war there while English soldiers and French soldiers were sitting in the tower. That's quite extraordinary. The border became more and more difficult to get across. The Belgians were doing, the usual thing of fortifying the border, so they had electric wires very shortly, machine gun posts, minefields, etc. Much of the borders is rivers, so you've got to get across not only all that lot, but also got to wade across a river or swim across a river or find a boat on the river and run the risk of being shot at. So getting away for these guys who were caught on the Belgian down the left hand here in the mining area around Mons was difficult, but they had to get guides to take them through Brussels mostly and onwards up to Antwerp and across to the Netherlands. The world of Edith was getting more and more difficult as well because the Germans were very systematic, as we know them to be. And they said, we will get the police in here and the secret agents, and we will find out what the networks are and what the mechanisms are for getting these men away. And so huge numbers of people were deployed to chat up the locals, to investigate any leads, and to build a kind of a wall against these guys getting out. They were chasing them. They were plotting against them. They were catching them. They were missing them by chance. And they didn't notice that Edith's 4 houses were full of these guys for that whole 9 months. And they compiled evidence. And eventually they got them. I want to read you one story. There are lots of stories of individuals. This one is Harry Beaumont, who was the Royal West Kent Regiment. He arrived at the clinic in March 1915. He'd been captured after Mons, suffering from the combined effects of a German shell and a collapsing brick wall. On August the 27th, 1914, he found himself in a hospital under German supervision. There he acted as a supernumerary medical orderly, quietly retiring to a scrap iron shed when the German officer in charge appeared. So he was useful to his own people in the hospital and the Germans trying to run the hospital, but they wanted to keep him out of the way. However, in October, he was detected and was told he'd be sent to Stettin in Germany. With a friend, he managed to get away to a nearby cottage, a miner's cottage, very close by, where he remained until February 1915, where an attempted arrest there in the cottage meant they had to be found new placements. So then the guy who brought the two men that I talked about earlier on to Edith got to hear of these two soldiers. He took their photographs, presented them with fake papers, and provided them with a guide who took them to Brussels. There they were amazed to be greeted by an English woman who was evidently in charge. And she was, of course, Edith Cavell. She showed them up to a room. Do you remember I told you, look at the skyline of those houses? A room at the very top of the house where the only light came from a skylight. The room, 36 foot long, 9 foot wide, was virtually without windows because it was matchboarded all round. Around 18 soldiers were up there. None of them knew the lady's surname. She was just known as his sister Edith. She would chat to them in the evenings, an event eagerly anticipated. She told the soldiers it would be safe to go out in the evenings, provided they left the clinic singly or in couples, kept to quiet thoroughfares, and refrained from speaking English within earshot of anyone. She told Harry Beaumont that she herself would rather the soldiers didn't go out, but they were not prisoners, so she had no right to keep them in. Talk about guts. So, on the third night of Harry's stay there, when he himself had remained indoors, an extraordinary incident occurred. Some Irish soldiers went out together into a local pub, coming home, singing down the street, "It's a long way to Tipperary." Wasn't that amazing? And of course, Edith was absolutely furious because it could have blown her cover completely. And they were spirited away the next day, along with Harry. And Harry and his colleague stayed for a while with the chemist. The intention was to take them to Holland one way, along with four soldiers from the clinic. On the way, Beaumont spotted Zeppelins in a hangar. They were taken through Louvain and they reached a monastery. There they had to turn back, go all the way back to Brussels because the area was now, quote, seething with Germans. This is his autobiography. Once again, they tried to cross the frontier to a different place. This time they got to Antwerp and after several perilous weeks there, crossed the border and reached Flushing. At Tilbury, back in England, Beaumont reported about the two Zeppelins. 2 weeks later, they were destroyed by two British seaplanes. So Beaumont had an interesting war, and fascinating to see him crossing the path of Edith. May 1915, she decided that she must carry on. And the quote is, she'd been thinking about all those Germans outside her front door and parading in the streets and trying to find these men. Don't send any more men, but we must save them. If one were caught and shot, that would be our fault. I think that's heroic, selfless. So then, eventually, the network was closed in on and 35 of them were arrested. She was arrested on August the 5th and interrogated. Very interesting cross-examination processes, especially when you're being interrogated in German. It's translated into French, which isn't your language anyway. You reply in French, it's translated back into German, and you've no idea what they're saying to one another or how accurately they're recording what you say. She was held for solitary confinement for 10 weeks. You'll see where in a minute. And she was tried with 34 others, October the 7th and 8th. The sentences were recommended on the end of the day of the 8th. She'd had 10 minutes trial, literally 10 minutes, and then they said, next. Her defense counsel, who was only arranged at the very last minute, was given 2 minutes to say something, and then the prosecutor said, no, that's rather rubbish, and said, next. So five were recommended to be shot, two of them being Edith and the one who shot with her, as you hear. Five were recommended for 10 or longer years hard labour, 17 had lesser imprisonment, and eight were acquitted. German court of five judges. Saint-Gilles prison, that's where it's still there today, Victorian heritage like we have. I think Durham's got quite a Victorian jail, hasn't it? I think so. Anyway, in there, here's her cell, cell 23, and there she sat for 10 weeks in solitary confinement. She had to undo her bed. They watched her through the door all day. Here's where she was tried in the Belgian Parliament Senate chamber, the conspiracy trial, and they decided the sentences, having had them recommended by the prosecutor. They decided on the 9th, Saturday, Monday the 11th afternoon, they were announced, and Edith heard that she was to be shot the next morning with Philippe Bowburn. And she wrote this it's amazingly poignant text in the front of this book that had been one of her companions in Through the Cell. And it's annotated all down the sides of places she was reading this little bit of this medieval book where she actually notes, I was reading this October the 7th or whatever. And this is her dedication to her cousin, E.D. Cavell. She wanted the book to go to him, and I have seen the original. It was then reprinted in 1920 by the Dean of Westminster, and a very common thing in many, many households because of her life and death. This man came to her in her cell on the night of the 11th. He was the chaplain in Brussels for the Anglican Church, and she knew him well. He'd been at a Christmas party with her in her house, which she invited lots of local children to and had some soldiers up for. He knew quite a lot about what she was doing, and they talked a lot, and he'd given her advice, probably don't do it. But anyway, he came in, amazing to come at 9:30 at night, knowing she was going to be shot 7 the next morning. And he had an hour with her. And that is, for me, part of the most poignant part of the story. Here he is coming, never expected to be visiting a woman who's going to be shot. And they shared communion, and they said, "This abide with me," which I'm sure you know. But should you ever, the next time you sing it or you hear it sung, think about Edith and this chaplain saying the words of that together as they sat together in that tiny cell. Here he is. I'll just read the last verse. I often choke doing this, so forgive me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes. Shine through the gloom. Point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks. Earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me. I said she's a woman of hope. That's her hope, that heaven's morning breaks tomorrow morning. And she said to Gaham, don't think of me as a heroine and a martyr, because that's what he'd said he'd thought of her as. Just think of me as a nurse who tried to do her duty. Standing as I do, these are her famous last words, really, for posterity. Standing as I do in the light of God and eternity. Shot next morning. I've realized patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone. That's the foundation of hope after a war. That's the foundation of forgiveness. That's the foundation of reconciliation. That's the foundation of the new world order. And that is absolutely core business for her. And I just salute it. I remain in awe of this woman. That's where she was shot. Here's the man she was shot with. He was shot partly because he'd helped the soldiers, but also because he kept publishing this free newspaper, which was having a go at the Germans and giving the truth about what was going on. She became an international heroine. Soon as Kipling, the PR man for the British government in those days, got news of that execution, it was gold dust to him because the war wasn't going well. and he really exploited it. I have seen stuff from all over the known world where that was reported in the days of the telegraph system. Memorials, Kipling over-egged it, but some people over-egged it. This was an innocent young nurse of 25, looking beautiful and all the rest. She was a fine woman, but she wasn't 25, she was 49 and looking very haggard. Shot by the German officer when his men refused to fire. They shot her and Boke. 8 men did what they were told to do. And it is said by somebody, and I don't actually trust it because it's a sort of a kind of myth, that she might have said to the men as she faced them, "Do your duty as I have done mine." I think that's possibly embellishment, but it's actually not bad for what she might have thought. Mementos. You've seen the trench lighters, matchboxes, cigar labels, stamps, postcards, you name it, we had it. Naming after her. Hospitals, wards, ambulances, streets, schools, homes for nurses, homes, and children named after her. Edith Piaf, definitely known to be named after Edith Cavell. Her story was told. Books, plays, operas. We did a recreation of one of those in Malta last year after 7 years' work. And films, many films, Italian films, British films, all sorts. And finally, memorials. The Swardeston east window that you saw in that early picture was blank. It's now filled with a representation of Jesus on the cross, and immediately underneath her, a kneeling nurse with the imitation of Christ, and greater love hath no man than this, than he lay down his life for his friends. Statues, huge one, 40 feet high in the centre of London, just along from our other hero, Nelson. Banners. Oh, a banner. Full circle, good people. Thank you for listening. I'll shut up and stop sharing this. And
the trial, was that conducted by the Belgians, and the Germans under some martial law kind of provision?
yeah,
I thought it was in their Parliament building or something.
they took over the Parliament building and used it as their courtroom for all the big trials, and it was entirely German. 5 German military judges, a German military prosecutor, and only Belgian defense lawyers, basically. Mainly conducted in German, which didn't help the poor French-speaking 34 defendants or their defense counsel, because everything had to be translated. So, I mean, a 2-day trial cut it in half to 1 day because of the time required for everything to be translated. It was martial law. It does accord with their understanding of what they could condemn people for. Basically, they condemned these people because they had assisted men to the enemy. That's the technical term, i.e., they'd taken steps to help people get back to the armies that they came from, and therefore they could fight against Germany again. And that, in total war, is not acceptable. Obviously, if they'd caught the men, they could have put them in prisoner of war camps if they were soldiers. But the civilian population, they would certainly put them away, and they did. They took, as I said, quite a lot of the co colleagues of Edith were put in prison for the rest of the war in Germany. I'm going to ask you a question, all of you. Is it Cavell or is it Cavell? I'll put you all out of your misery. Normally, I have a show of hands, and it's normally 50-50, even in Norfolk. The answer is both are right. In Norfolk, it's generally Cavell because, as her father said, our surname rhymes with travel, not with hell, as a vicar, you can imagine. But anywhere in Europe, she's always Cavell because in French, the stress is on the second syllable, the last syllable. So both right, go to the top of the class.
Can you see any significance instead of Jack, the dog?
Yeah.
The letter.
Well, no, I can't. I think possibly people would wonder why the dog would appear on the banner. So the letter, she's a very important Yeah, her letters are fascinating. Wanted to read you a tiny bit of her very last letter, which I only discovered about 4 years ago, um, where she has to write in code, okay, sort of in code, because her mother knew that she was in difficulty in Brussels, but she couldn't really say too much to her mum because otherwise mum would have had a seizure of some sort. So how about this for her? I'm just going to read you the very last bits of this letter to her mother, dated 26th of July, 1915. She's going to be arrested on the 5th of August. We have more patients just now and are glad we shall not have to move them far because the new nurses' home is about to open. When I get a good photo of the new place, I'll try and send it to you. Jack is well and sends a lick. Her mother knew Jack because she'd been in Brussels for a few weeks in 1910. He's getting older. He's not as frisky as he used to be. There are no longer any motor cars to run after, so he lays outside and keeps his street in order. He's always overjoyed at a walk. My dearest love to you and all the family. I am looking forward to a happy meeting later on. When I return, there will be much to relate. Ever your affectionate daughter, Edith. That's very poignant because she can't say anything about what's really going on. It's the very last letter that she wrote to her mother that her mother ever received. There was one more that she wrote from her prison cell on the night she was about to be shot, but the Germans suppressed it. So letters are actually important. She wrote in very important letters to the Nursing Mirror as their anonymous Brussels correspondent, which she smuggled out via the American embassy and give some really interesting insights into what was going on in Brussels as a fellow nurse, to her nursing colleagues. So letters, yes, letters very important.
On that picture, the two pictures there. The one on the left was a card. It's this fabric, but it was it was on someone's mantelpiece. A neighbour of mine lent it to me. It was on her aunt's mantelpiece for as long as she could remember as a young girl.
How amazing! Yes, there is a fabric version, and there's a. I mean, it is a photograph that is done onto fabric effectively. There is we've got the actually original photograph with the two dogs, and then it was used in the 1915-16 period when her memory was very hot to make all sorts of things. I mean, she appears in that sort of guise on all sorts of ceramics and yeah, everything. Just extraordinary. There was very little, actually, apart from dead soldiers, there was very little alternative imagery, iconography, one could almost say, of the war. And it's interesting, when I didn't really deal with it, but when she came back, her body came back in 1919 after being exhumed in Brussels, came back with a full military honours and had a national memorial service in Westminster Abbey. That's May 1919. The poignancy is that this woman was the first person to have that sort of service with her remains in the Abbey from the First World War, because the Imperial War Graves Commission made a very early decision. We are not repatriating bodies. That's why you don't have First World War dead in any of your cemeteries unless they died having been seconded home, I mean, taken home with wounds and died here. And that meant, and this is really significant, I think, that Edith's body coming back in that full military honours, which was organised in 6 weeks from startup, complete startup. They said originally though she was just a family was saying, can we take her home to Norwich via Harwich? And somebody said, no, 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 we can't allow this woman just to sort of go quietly to a grave in Norfolk. We've got to make something of this. And in 6 weeks, they went from a standing start to getting her out of Brussels with full military honours that end, the King and Queen at the station, big service, which Gayan actually preached at, on the train to Ostend, just as she'd come to Brussels. So she went back from Brussels to Ostend, HMS Rowena, and an escort of 2 frigates across the Channel, Dover, on a train from Dover in a van. If you ever come south and you're interested in seeing the Cavell van, it's sitting in the Tenterden in the Kent Light Railway, and we brought it up here for 2015 because that same van not only took her body, but literally 6 months later, 5 months later, May, November, 6 months later, it took the body of the unknown soldier from Kent, from Dover up to Westminster Abbey. And as we know, the unknown soldier was buried in the entrance of the Abbey. You cannot get in through the west door of the Abbey without encountering the unknown soldier. And she had been there, her body had gone through that same door. And nobody had been able to grieve a real body. Now, it sounds morbid, maybe, but actually, this is a representation of my beloved son who died on the Western Front. By this stage in 1990, nobody had gone to visit war graves. They weren't ready. And so this is hugely significant as a bit of iconography for the whole British nation, indeed the whole world, really, this woman coming home as a victim of a war, as a heroine who gave her life so that others may live. And here we are, the heirs and successors. Sorry, I'm being a bit over dramatic about it, but people don't see it. It's actually terribly, terribly, terribly important.
I suspect that the reason, getting back to that question, why is it on our banner? I suspect that that is all there is to it, that it was so important to people at the time. I mean, I don't know how many people at this Zoom meeting know anything about the history of our banner. Some of you do know a lot, I know, but would you like me very quickly to summarize what we know about it? Fragments of it were kept in someone's loft for 20, 30 years till the 1990s, when they were taken to an exhibition of banners in Durham, which had been organised by Bill or Arthur Moyes, who subsequently wrote a book about it. The next year, the book came out about all those banners, including what he described as the most significant of all Durham miners' banners, the Bowburn one. These two fragments, basically the portrait and the logo and stuff along the top, the writing along the top, were, by the time we got them, in a shocking state. They were dirty, fragile, had been screwed up in a carrier bag, as I said, in someone's loft. And we fortunately got money from the Heritage Lottery Fund to have them assembled onto a backcloth, cleaned, flattened out. Paint conservators and fabric conservator were involved in creating what we have now. But the story that was told to Arthur Moyes at this exhibition by the chap who handed it to him was that a Mr. Marrington, with an M, or at least that's what presumably he had in his handwritten notes when he wrote it up into the book, had created this banner, and it was so awful a portrait that he was demoted from his job as colliery painter and set about carrying water, leading water. And that was what we were supposed to have received 20 years ago now. When it went to the Conservatives, it turned out this was a total fiction. It was an extremely expensive silk banner made by Tuttill's of London, and a very fine, large one at that. And I subsequently found out that it had been actually unfurled in the Hare and Greyhounds pub in the Miners' Lodge room there in 1920. I spoke to a witness of that occasion, the son of the Chet Wayman at the time, who had been, I think, aged 10 when he witnessed the occasion. So what I suspect happened was that it was painted by a banner with Edith Cavell's portrait on was painted perhaps on an old bed sheet or something to take into the Miners' Gala in 1919, a couple of months after her exhumed body was returned to Britain. This may have been a rather poor portrait, and it may have been mocked and disapproved of indeed, but the Miners' Lodge must then have commissioned a proper one using the card or the equivalent as a portrait for it to be copied. And it went into the Miners' Gala in 1920 after being unfurled in there in greyhounds in all its glory, and it appeared there and through for the next 2 decades. The painter's name was not Marrington, but Harrington, James Harrington. If you want to know his nickname, it was Professor Harrington. He's a ventriloquist, in fact. And his son, James, his name is on the, can you see it? Behind my left shoulder, you can see a tall brass. No, you can't, sorry, it's round the corner. No, it's to the right of that door on the right of the picture. The First World War memorial, brass memorial in the foyer of the community centre has James Harrington's name on. He was killed in 1916. He was in the British Expeditionary Force, signed up in August, as soon as the war broke out in 1914. He came home injured in 1915, went back out again later that year and died I think it was June 1916. So his father painted, I believe, the portrait of Edith Cavell, which didn't go down very well. He was a house painter, not a portrait painter. But they're the link ends, I think, because James was injured, I think, on the 31st of August, 1915. He was in Étaples Hospital by the 2nd of August in 1915, and Edith Cavell was arrested in, was it 4th or 5th of August?
5th, yeah.
So it seems unlikely that he passed through her hands himself, but he might have known people who were, or there might have been others who had experience from Bowburn, I don't know, but I suspect it was no more than that it was a hugely significant popular event at the time.
One of the trench lighters might have been in the possession of one of the Durham soldiers who returned in 1918. It's quite possible. We haven't ever found a British version of that trench lighter, or the various different designs. But they might, at the end of this is where history and optimism come together. And you say, well, maybe one of those English soldiers from Durham swapped his lighter, which had possibly, we've definitely found lighters with a king's head on them, swapped his British lighter for one of the Edith Cavell lighters from a French colleague or an American colleague before they went home. Who knows? And maybe that helped to sort of bring the whole thing together. Extraordinary how some of these actual little memorial kind of things could have created so much, I don't know, so much in-depth involvement of all sorts of people. Anyway, we'll see. We'll find out one day.
Does anyone else any questions or comments?
An excellent talk. Very, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. I love doing it, as you can probably gather, and I do it all sorts of places for various reasons, but I've never done one for someone, an organization like yours, and it's a great privilege, and thank you very much for having me. Do look at the website if you're that way inclined. It's called edithcavell.org.uk, and it's top of the pops for Edith. But there's lots of stuff there about lighters. There's lots of stuff. I haven't put anything on about this tonight, or the links and all the rest of it that we've tried to create. But there is an awful lot of stuff there, and there will be more. I mean, I did a couple of evenings just around October the 12th, because I thought it was time that we had something on this. And I used 5 different people who encountered Edith, where she radically changed their lives. One was a little girl who became her maid, left behind by her father in Brussels, who was a circus man, and he just left her. And he just said, "Oh, send her to me. I'll find her something to do." One was one of the many soldiers that we have stories about. One was a nurse who got into real problems because she had a illegitimate child. And normally in nursing, they would have said, "That's the end of your career." Edith said, "No, no, I'll help you have the child. We'll get it adopted because the link's back in England. And then, please come back and join me. I'd love to have you." And that is absolutely countercultural in those days. All sorts of reasons why you wouldn't do it. And one is Galen, because that really did change his life that evening. So it's just a new way of telling the story, trying to be imaginative, trying to make it sing for people when, if you just tell the history, the actual facts, it's dead dull, isn't it, really? Yeah.
Okay, and no more questions or comments? If not, thank you enormously. That was a fantastic. I mean, it's a wonderful subject, obviously, which makes it easy for you, Nick. But very well presented and hugely interesting. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Great.
Goodbye, everyone.
Lovely. Bye.
Thank you.
Pleasure.